I've spent most of my life pretending I was an ordinary person. That's probably the strangest part about confessing any of this now. If you met me 10 years ago, you would have seen a quiet guy working overnight maintenance jobs, drinking gas station coffee at 3 a.m., barely making eye contact. The kind of person people forget 5 seconds after a conversation ends. That worked in my favor. People underestimate invisible men. Anyway, this happened when I was 32, back when I worked maintenance for a commercial security company in Ohio. We handled electronic locks, keypad systems, badge readers, all the stuff businesses use to make themselves feel safe. Banks, medical offices, warehouses, apartment buildings. If a door opened with a buzz instead of a key, there was a decent chance I'd serviced it at some point. And that's where the phrase came from. Secret access, doors that open without a key. Our supervisor used to joke about it during training. He'd laugh while waving around a master programmer tablet like it was magic. Everyone else thought it was funny. I didn't. Because once you understand how those systems work, you stop seeing doors the same way. You realize most security isn't security at all. It's theater. Layers of trust stacked on top of lazy assumptions. And I was broke enough to notice. At the time, I was drowning in debt. My mother's medical bills had buried me. Credit cards maxed out. Rent late 3 months in a row. Every paycheck disappeared before it hit my account. I remember sitting in my car outside my apartment one night, engine off because I couldn't afford gas, staring at an overdraft notification on my phone. Then I got a work order. Blackwood Storage Solutions. Privately owned records warehouse on the edge of the city. Old building. Minimal staff. They stored paper archives for law firms and financial companies, boxes and boxes of documents nobody wanted digitally exposed. The place used electronic badge access on every floor. I remember walking through the facility during inspection and noticing something important immediately. The back-end doors still used an outdated fail-safe magnetic lock system. For people who don't know what that means, those locks stay locked only while electricity flows through them. Cut the power for even half a second. The doors open. That knowledge sat in my head for weeks like poison. I told myself I was only curious at first. That's the lie everyone tells themselves before crossing a line. Curiosity sounds harmless. Cleaner than desperation. But I kept thinking about the warehouse. No overnight guards. No cameras in the archive aisles themselves. And according to overheard conversations during installation, certain law firms stored sealed evidence files there temporarily before court transfers. Drugs. Fraud. Cash seizures. Valuable things hidden inside cardboard anonymity. I didn't even know exactly what I was looking for yet. I just knew there was a door somewhere in that building that could open without a key. And for the first time in my life, I started wondering what would happen if I walked through it. After that first visit to Blackwood Storage Solutions, I became obsessed with the place in a way that honestly scared me a little. I started volunteering for every maintenance call connected to the building, faulty badge readers, software updates, even replacing burned-out hallway sensors. Nobody questioned it because nobody ever questions the guy willing to take extra work. That's the thing about access. Most people think breaking in is about force. It isn't. Real access comes from being expected. Over the next month, I memorized the building without trying to look like I was memorizing it. Delivery schedules. Employee habits. Which doors stuck during humidity. Which cameras had dead angles during nighttime infrared mode. I even learned the sound each lock made before disengaging. There was one weak point, a rear electrical maintenance corridor connected to the archive wing. Hidden from the main office area. Almost never used. The fail-safe magnetic lock there depended entirely on uninterrupted power. I tested it accidentally one night during repairs. Flipped the breaker for less than a second. Click. The door opened immediately. That sound stayed in my head for days. I wish I could say there was one dramatic moment where I decided to become a criminal. There wasn't. It happened slowly, through repetition. Every overdue bill, every collection call, every night lying awake staring at water stains on my apartment ceiling, all of it chipped away at whatever moral certainty I thought I had. I started justifying things in stages. First, I told myself I only wanted to look inside the archive rooms. Then I convinced myself that huge corporations insured everything anyway. Then came the worst thought of all: if the opportunity exists and nobody notices, maybe it isn't really stealing. That idea is dangerous. Around that time, I began carrying a small notebook during jobs. Nothing suspicious. Just maintenance details mixed with observations about Blackwood's security routines. Shift changes. Alarm reset times. Which employees smoked outside and left doors unsecured for 30 seconds too long. I still remember the exact moment things became real. I found out one archive room temporarily held confiscated cash records tied to an ongoing fraud investigation. And suddenly this wasn't fantasy anymore. Once I crossed that mental line, planning became almost automatic. I stopped thinking like a maintenance worker and started thinking like someone trying to disappear inside a system he already understood. The hardest part wasn't getting into Blackwood. I could probably do that blindfolded by then. The hardest part was leaving no pattern behind. I chose a Thursday night because staffing was always thinner before weekends. One receptionist until 10 p.m., one rotating floor supervisor, no armed security. I also knew a storm was forecast that evening, which mattered more than people realize. Storms create excuses for glitches, brief outages, camera flickers, alarm delays. I prepared carefully. Neutral clothes without logos. Cheap gloves from a hardware store. A flashlight with red tape over the lens to dim the brightness. Nothing traceable. Nothing memorable. The key detail was timing the power interruption. 3 seconds maximum. Enough to release the magnetic lock. Not enough to trigger a full backup alert. At least that was the theory I kept repeating to myself while pretending I wasn't terrified. The storm arrived earlier than expected. By 9 p.m., rain was hammering the city hard enough to blur traffic lights into glowing smears across the windshield. I parked 2 blocks from Blackwood and sat there listening to the weather and my own breathing for almost 20 minutes. I could still leave, I remember thinking. That's what bothers me now. I had so many chances to walk away. Instead, I pulled my hood up and headed toward the building through the alley behind the loading docks. The rain actually helped. Nobody pays attention to a soaked maintenance guy carrying a toolbox during bad weather. Inside the rear utility corridor, everything smelled like dust and hot wiring. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the screwdriver while opening the electrical panel. I counted silently. 1, 2, 3. I flipped the breaker back on. For half a second, the hallway went dark. Then came the sound I'd been hearing in my imagination for weeks. Click. The magnetic lock released exactly like I knew it would. The moment the door opened, panic hit me harder than I expected. Not fear of getting caught exactly, more like the sudden realization that I was no longer pretending. I had actually done it. The archive wing was colder than the rest of the building. Rows of gray shelves stretched through the darkness like narrow tunnels. Thousands of boxes stacked floor to ceiling, each labeled with case numbers and company names that meant nothing to me. At first, I moved too quickly. That's another thing nobody tells you about crime. Adrenaline makes you stupid. I nearly knocked over a cart because I kept imagining security guards appearing around corners. But nobody came. I found the section I'd memorized from previous visits: temporary legal storage. Sealed evidence transfers. My flashlight drifted across labels until one case number matched the notebook entry I'd written weeks earlier. That box felt strangely light when I pulled it down. Inside were documents, evidence bags, and 2 vacuum-sealed bundles of cash. That was the moment greed replaced fear completely. I should have left immediately after finding the money. That would have been the smart move. Take the cash, close the box, disappear before anyone noticed the gap. But greed changes your sense of proportion. Once you convince yourself you're already guilty, taking a little more suddenly doesn't feel worse. I started checking nearby boxes. Most contained exactly what you'd expect: paper evidence, hard drives, sealed envelopes. But then I opened another case file connected to the same fraud investigation and found something I wasn't prepared for: photographs. Not crime scene photos. Surveillance shots. Pictures of people exchanging bags, meeting in parking lots, entering office buildings. One of the men looked painfully familiar. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then my stomach dropped. I recognized him because he'd visited Blackwood earlier that week wearing an expensive coat and smiling like he owned the building. One of the company executives had personally escorted him through the archive wing. That's when I realized something terrifying. The people tied to those files weren't just criminals. They had connections inside Blackwood itself. The first sound came from somewhere beyond the shelving rows. Footsteps. Slow. Uneven. Getting closer. Every instinct in my body locked up at once. I killed the flashlight immediately and crouched behind the shelves, trying not to breathe too loudly. The archive wing became pitch black except for thin strips of emergency lighting along the floor. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard voices. 2 men. One sounded irritated, complaining about the storm affecting the security system. The other stayed quiet for a while before saying something that made my blood freeze. "Check the archive room anyway." I remember gripping the cash so tightly my fingers hurt. My brain kept searching for explanations, maybe routine patrol, maybe coincidence, but deep down I already knew. Somebody had noticed the brief power interruption. The men split up. One headed toward the opposite aisle. The other started walking directly toward me. And in that moment, hidden between shelves full of evidence and stolen money, I understood how quickly a stupid decision can turn into real danger. I could hear him breathing before I could see him. That's what I remember most clearly. Not the footsteps. Not the fear. Just the sound of another person somewhere in the dark, close enough to touch. I slid deeper between the shelves, pressing myself against cold metal racks while trying to think. Running would make noise. Fighting him was impossible. The only advantage I had was that he didn't know exactly where I was. Then his flashlight swept across the aisle. For half a second, the beam passed inches from my face. "Probably another damn outage," he muttered. I stayed perfectly still. My legs were cramping, rainwater dripping from my jacket onto the floor in tiny sounds that felt deafening to me. I honestly thought he'd hear my heartbeat. Then something unexpected happened. A phone rang somewhere near the entrance. The man cursed under his breath and walked away to answer it. I waited there in darkness for nearly 2 full minutes before moving again, but by then the situation had changed completely. Now I knew they were actively searching the building. Once the voices disappeared, I decided the money wasn't worth dying over. That sounds obvious now, but fear finally cut through the adrenaline enough for me to think clearly again. I stuffed the cash into my backpack, sealed the evidence boxes as best I could, and headed back toward the maintenance corridor. That's when I saw the red light. The rear access door was locked down. A silent security protocol must have activated after the power interruption. No alarm, no flashing sirens, just a sealed magnetic lock and a tiny red indicator glowing above the keypad like an accusation. I remember whispering, "No, no, no," under my breath while trying the handle anyway. Nothing. My planned exit was gone. Then the overhead speakers crackled to life. "Attention! Security sweep in progress. Please remain where you are." The message sounded calm, almost polite, which somehow made it worse. I suddenly realized I was trapped inside a secured evidence facility carrying stolen cash during an active search. And somewhere in the building, people were already looking for me. Panic makes time feel strange. Seconds stretch out until they feel physical, like something pressing against your chest. I knew staying in the archive wing was suicide. Eventually someone would search aisle by aisle and find me crouched beside shelves full of evidence. So I forced myself to think like the maintenance worker I used to be. Buildings always have systems behind the systems. I remembered an old service passage connected to the ventilation controls near the basement utility room. Employees rarely used it because it smelled awful and flooded during heavy rain. Most people probably didn't even know it existed. I moved fast but tried to stay quiet, keeping my flashlight pointed low. Twice I heard distant voices echoing through nearby corridors. Once, I caught the beam of another flashlight crossing an intersection ahead of me and barely ducked away in time. When I finally reached the utility room, water was already leaking beneath the door from the storm outside. Good. That meant fewer people would want to come down there. For the first time all night, I felt like I might actually escape. The service passage was worse than I remembered. The moment I forced the rusted door open, a wave of damp air hit me hard enough to make me gag. The narrow corridor beyond was half flooded with dark rainwater leaking through cracked foundation walls. Every step produced loud splashes no matter how carefully I moved. I kept thinking about electricity. One exposed wire down there, and I'd die standing in ankle-deep water holding stolen cash. Halfway through the passage, I heard another noise behind me, metal scraping against concrete. Someone had entered the utility room. My heart nearly stopped. Flashlight beams swept briefly across the doorway at the far end of the corridor. Voices echoed faintly. "Check down there!" I moved faster, almost slipping twice. The backpack felt heavier with every step, dragging against my shoulders like a physical reminder of everything I'd risked for it. Then the corridor narrowed sharply ahead. Blocked. Collapsed piping and debris sealed most of the exit. For one horrible second, I thought I trapped myself underground with nowhere left to run. I started tearing at the debris with my bare hands. That's the part movies always get wrong about desperation. It isn't dramatic. It's ugly and frantic and fueled by pure animal panic. I was slipping in dirty water, cutting my fingers on broken metal, barely able to breathe while the voices behind me grew closer. Then I noticed cold air moving through the rubble. A gap. Small, but enough. I shoved the backpack through first and squeezed after it, scraping my shoulders hard against exposed concrete pipes. For a second I genuinely thought I was stuck. My chest compressed so tightly I couldn't inhale properly. Then the concrete gave way beneath me. I dropped into the alley outside behind the building, landing hard on wet asphalt. Freedom didn't feel heroic. It felt painful. Rain hammered the alley while alarms finally began screaming somewhere inside Blackwood. Maybe they'd found the damaged passage. Maybe someone had discovered the opened evidence boxes. I grabbed the backpack and ran without looking back once. By morning, the entire city would know someone had broken into Blackwood Storage Solutions. For 3 straight days, I barely left my apartment. Every siren outside sounded like police coming for me. Every knock from neighbors made my stomach twist. I kept the stolen cash hidden inside an old toolbox beneath my kitchen sink because somehow that felt less suspicious than a bank account. The news spread fast. Blackwood publicly blamed the break-in on storm-related security failures. But unofficial rumors painted a different picture. Employees were being questioned. Internal investigations started. One article mentioned possible links between missing evidence and financial corruption cases already under federal review. That terrified me more than the burglary itself. Because now I understood something I hadn't before. I hadn't stolen from faceless corporations. I'd stepped into a conflict involving dangerous people with money and influence. Then things got worse. A black sedan started appearing near my apartment building. Always parked across the street. Always there at night. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe paranoia. But one evening, while taking out trash, I noticed someone sitting inside the car watching my building without moving. I never got arrested for the Blackwood job. At least not officially. The sedan disappeared after about a week, and eventually the investigation faded from local headlines. Maybe the people involved didn't want police digging too deeply into those files. Maybe I was too small to matter. Either way, I survived long enough to convince myself I'd escaped. But getting away with something isn't the same as winning. That's the part younger people misunderstand when they fantasize about crime. The real punishment isn't always prison. Sometimes it's what happens to your mind afterward. Even now, years later, I still notice security cameras before anything else in a room. I still avoid eye contact with police officers. Sudden knocks at the door make my pulse spike instantly. Part of me never left that archive wing. And the money? Most of it vanished within a year anyway. Debt. Rent. Bad decisions. Nothing magical. Nothing life-changing. So if anyone reading this thinks secret access means freedom, listen carefully. Doors that open without keys usually close behind you eventually.